As you probably noticed from the picture being a little different, we are on to another part of our study. It's the second to last part. One more part after this. I guess we're to the point where we can count the lessons at this point. 12 more? 13 more? Somebody could count them. I can't, but somebody could. It's either 12 or 13. Matthew 27, again. Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 19. We're moving into the crucifixion. And after this, it'll be the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. That's the last part. So this is a pretty important section for obvious reasons, looking at the crucifixion. And this afternoon's lesson is basically the very start of that process. We've already seen where Pilate, or the Jews, had tried Jesus. They take him to Pilate. They didn't really try him at all, but they take him to Pilate as a man who has done things worthy of death, not as a condemned man, but trying to convince Pilate to come to that same conclusion. He didn't come to that same conclusion, but then they tried to entrap him and successfully did get Pilate to basically give them what they were demanding, even though he didn't think Jesus deserved it. And now, the last thing we read, other than the account about Judas, was that he delivered him over to them to be crucified. He'd already scourged him, had him scourged. Now he's going to deliver him over to be crucified, which means that process is about to begin. But when you think about the cross, what kinds of things come to your mind? Anything. No wrong answers. Pain, okay. I hear somebody else? Suffering. Blood. Sacrifice. Yeah. Trying to carry the thing. It's amazing to me how much different we think of the cross than the people at that time would have thought about it. When we think about it, we think of Jesus instantly. I mean, how could you not? But to them, it was not just a horrifying thing, but just a shameful thing, a reproach, something you would not want to be associated with. That's been sort of flipped around because of Jesus. It's become a mark of almost honor, but in reality, back then it was the exact opposite, dishonor. It wasn't something that you would boast about, that you were going to get to be crucified and I'll be memorialized forever, as this special thing happened. It was embarrassing, it was shameful, it was a reproach, and now here we are. Jesus has come, like he told Pilate, for this purpose I'd come to the earth, to bear witness to the truth. Well, another purpose of his in coming to the earth was to give his life, and now he's there. The time has come. Everything written in the Scriptures up to this point, and everything we've studied leads us up to this moment. John 21, verse 25 says, if everything about Jesus was written, the world wouldn't be able to hold the books. Not enough space in the world. And that is, this study has taken us through the whole year, but to me it seems like we've barely even started. I mean, it's just like it just has flown by. And it just goes to show how selective it is of how much is recorded of Jesus' life. And yet everything that we've read about and everything that could have been written that wasn't, this is the moment. It all is leading up to this. Not just because it was going to be the end of his life on earth, but because it was the purpose of his life on earth. And the same thing that John said about everything if everything was written about Jesus, the world wouldn't be able to hold the books. You could say that about the crucifixion itself. There's so much that could be written that is not written, but what we have is what we have, and that's what we're going to look at over these next few lessons at least. So preparations have been made for the crucifixion. Instructions had been given. Soldiers had to be assigned to do that. A sign had to be made, an inscription. We'll see that. I'm sure there was plenty of paperwork, of some kind, however that would work back then. Is around 9 a.m. at this time. Everything was ready to go. So today we're going to be looking at the trip to the place that we call Calvary. We sing about it. We hear about it. We talk about it. That's where Jesus was going to be taken to be crucified, because it was obviously the normal place for that to happen. Would not be a very fun road to take. We're going to start in Luke's account in Luke 23. We'll read a few verses there, verses 26 through 33, and then we'll refer to some of the others, and then we'll for the next section we'll be looking mainly at Mark's account. But here's what Luke records. Luke 23, beginning in verse 26 says, "And as they led him away, they seized one, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, 'Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?' 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left." You can already tell just how abbreviated the whole account is, because the last thing we read in Luke's account there in verse 25 is that they released Barabbas. That feels like ages ago that we were talking about that already, even though it was just last week. And yet, he delivered Jesus over to the will, and that's the very next thing where we just started reading. That they led him away, and they seize a man, Simon of Cyrene. So there's a procession being led down this road. Jesus being led. Obviously, the 2 criminals were there. The 2 that were crucified next to him. Soldiers. And then we get, again, this picture of this crowd. Even now, Jesus, there's a crowd. All these people. Women and even children. It says, a great multitude of people and of women. Apparently there was a greater number of women. And they were lamenting, mourning for Jesus. I'm not sure if this happened very often, to be honest. I don't know. I can't speak to it. I wasn't alive then. I've never seen it happen before. But generally speaking, those that were going to be led away to be crucified were criminals, like the other 2, that generally would have deserved what they're getting. I wonder how many different cases, of course, a criminal's mother or wife or something is going to mourn, even if they broke the law, they're going to be sad and mourn the case of their loved one. But I wonder how many times in the past there had been somebody being led away to be crucified that where this great multitude of people are following along and mourning and creating a sort of, kind of a fuss over one of those who was about to be crucified. And I wonder if it was very rare, what the soldiers thought. This is already was a weird case, and it just keeps getting more and more unique and strange to them. And we learn from this that Jesus was bearing what is called in verse 26 simply the cross. He's carrying the cross. And they were going to get somebody to help him to carry it. Now, if we flip over to John's account, John 19, verse 17, it says, "So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha." So he's bearing his own cross. Now, this is sort of a subject of maybe controversy for some, because the general idea when you talk about carrying a cross is you're carrying the cross. It's a cross, and that's the only thing a cross is, and therefore if you're carrying it, that's what it is. But we have to keep in mind that the whole cross would have weighed probably over 300 pounds. One man's not going to be able to carry it, especially a man who's just been beaten like Jesus had been. What he probably was carrying was what we might call the cross bar, the cross beam. If you think about a T shape, like a cross we typically think of, you got two different lines. You draw a T. You got one, you got the other one. That is probably the thing that they were made to carry. And it still would have been pretty heavy. Could be, as much as 100 pounds, even then. But solid wood, that you're going to use for something like this is going to be pretty stout, pretty dense, and pretty heavy. Jesus, still, it would have been excruciating for him to have to carry even the cross beam, even a decent distance in his shape and his condition. He was obviously going to be a pretty physically fit guy, but he's just been scourged, flogged. So it probably wasn't, a very joyful experience walking at all, much less having to carry this thing. And it says that they recruited this man to help him. Whether that, according to Luke's account at least, doesn't indicate that he was struggling, but it may imply that he was struggling to carry it. And so the details of Scripture, and again, I'll refer to the movie, The Passion of the Christ, if you've never seen it. I think it's generally an excellent movie. I would recommend it to anybody. The cross-carrying scene is one of my least favorites because it seems, I don't like unnecessary exaggeration, and it almost is to the extent of almost seeming like a spoof film, because over and over, he falls, and then they got to pick him back up, and he falls again, they got to pick him back up. It happens maybe 4 or 5 times. But the way the gospel writers recorded it, just it's so simple. Just record the facts. Here's how it happened. And again, if this was just something that some people made up, it wouldn't be recorded like this. It wouldn't be so simple, matter of fact. It would be like that, extravagant details and this and that and this and just to make it more, and just like people do, and when they write stories, they're supposed to be, big deals, and this is as big a deal as anything ever was, and yet just so simple. What was that? 8 verses we just read from Luke's account, and that's pretty much the record of him journeying to the place of crucifixion. Yes.
The saying once said, and I think it is true, that dying for something is easier than living for it. Because when you're having a good time flies. It's like, wow, this is what. But if you're miserable, truly miserable, the seconds just drag.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a lot of ways, I think that's what the movie depicts. We're just, he walked, carried the cross, he died, and it was over. He lived those seconds.
Yeah.
Somebody had to watch it every step of the way.
Yep.
And
Would have been, no wonder they were mourning and lamenting. I mean, I don't care who you are or who this man was, it would be painful. I wouldn't want to watch it because your heart would, even for the criminals, your heart, somebody with a heart would still find themselves, pitying a person. And when we think about it being a man like Jesus, who was innocent and was who he was and taught what he taught, it just multiplies it times infinity. He endured all of this, not just the part of the cross that we think about, but he's already endured so much, and now he's enduring this. There was so much involved in the process of crucifixion, which we'll look at here in just a few minutes. But like I said, it seems that he was unable to carry it the whole way. Remember, he had been up all night. That alone would, I don't know if I'd be able to carry it at all anyway, but he was exhausted. He was not in the best way anyway because of his punishment that Pilate dealt to him. So they pressed someone to help him, and his name was Simon of Cyrene. He was recruited for this. Luke says he was coming in from the country. And they just apparently grabbed him and said, help him carry this. And it wasn't really an option, it seems. It kind of reminds me of, what Jesus referred to when he talked about if somebody forces you to walk a mile with you. Apparently it was not an unusual thing for, a Roman soldier or something it was sort of his prerogative. If he wanted you to help him carry something, he could tell you and you wouldn't have a choice, at least for 1 mile. Well, here we see Simon of Cyrene. I'm sure he had other things to do. He probably wasn't there to witness the crucifixion necessarily. They grab him and say, help him carry this. And again, the details of this man and the account of him helping him, that's it, as far as that account's concerned. Mark 15:21 says they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, father of Alexander and Rufus. So we've got his sons' names to carry his cross. That's it. How long did he carry it? I don't know. How long did it take? What all did he have to do? Of course, again, the accounts of it and the movies about it add a lot of details to that, but we don't know. All we know is this is a thing that this man probably never forgot. And I wish we could learn more about him, but yes.
what's his name? John D. Berry pointed this out in Hebrews 10:5, when he was talking about sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. When you think about the line of work that Jesus was in, the strength that would have taken to have done what he did, he actually was prepared to endure what the cross was going to bring to him, which is something, minute by minute, he was being built for this particular time. And I think that's what he's talking about in Hebrews. It would have taken that strength to have done this.
Yeah. A body you've prepared for me. And he, this God put on flesh. And I've made the point before that every single thing that Jesus did in his whole ministry, he could have done without becoming a man, being born of a woman. Could have taught. Angels and even the Lord himself often, maybe not often, but multiple times through the Old Testament period appeared to people in the form. He looked like a man. Angels usually look like men, look like people. You'd never know. Abraham and Sarah, they didn't know that those were angels. Jesus could have appeared like a man and did everything he did. Walked on water. I guess you could argue, I hesitate to use the word, could have been even easier to do things like walking on water, if you just look like a person, you're not actually flesh. Of course, when you're talking about a miracle, easier is not really an accurate term. There's no such thing. But this he could not do without becoming a man, being born of a woman, give his life, because you can't kill God. You can't kill a spirit. At least as far as we know, there's no way. You certainly can't be nailed to a cross if you don't have a body. But he put on a body that was prepared for him. And yes, that is a very powerful verse there that mentions that, just because it brings to our minds all these deeply spiritual things that involve Jesus becoming flesh. So, we don't know much about this Simon of Cyrene. The sons are mentioned, and the sons' names are probably mentioned because Mark expected them to know who they were. Otherwise, it doesn't really mean a whole lot. If somebody tells you, oh, it's so-and-so's, he's so-and-so's son, or, and you're like, I don't know who that is, so it doesn't help me much. So then the fact that they're mentioned seems to indicate that they may have known who they were, and if they knew who they were, that would indicate that they may have become Christians, and if they became Christians, it may indicate that Simon, their father, became a Christian. Maybe he was a disciple. He's not called a disciple, and I'm inclined to think that if he was at that time, he would have been called that here, but maybe he became one later. We know that there were Cyrenian Christians who spread the good news about Jesus in Acts 11. We read about a Rufus at least in one other place, Romans 16, so who knows, it could have been the same. But if nothing else, he has been immortalized in Scripture for being the one that was randomly chosen to help Jesus carry this cross. What an honor that would have been, even if it didn't feel like it at the moment. He may not have known anything about Jesus. In fact, if we want to get technical, he could have been in the same mindset as those who delivered Jesus to Pilate and didn't want and thought Jesus deserved it. Not saying he did, but he could have been. But it would have been a tremendous honor in hindsight, nevertheless, and named in Scripture and everything. So we don't know the exact path that was taken. Here's a map that our study included. You can see it on the website if you still have a link to that, whenever I included the link to it. But, of course, this is not inspired, but this would have been, we don't know, there's no legend on here, but wouldn't have been a short journey to get there. Obviously, there's going to be plenty of room for all kinds of people to be watching, which, again, even though a lot of them were mourning for Jesus, it's still embarrassing. The more people that are there, the more embarrassing it is, the more humiliating it is. And when you add everything else on top of it, there's nothing to add to it but more humiliation and suffering of some kind. And he had to go this way. It's called the Via Dolorosa, Way of Sorrows, probably for obvious reasons. But what he says to the women is very interesting. He says, don't cry for me. Cry for yourselves. Cry for your children. Because the days are coming when they're going to say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. What is he talking about, you think? Why would he say that? Seems like a weird thing to say to some of your sympathizers. He seems to me to be clearly referencing the doom that will come for Jerusalem because of this very situation. You need to be weeping for yourselves. These were obviously Jewish women. They were obviously those who maybe would become Christians, but maybe they weren't. And remember those words, let his blood be on us and our children. And those words, again, echo through the whole of time, still echoing, it seems. The passage, Jesus is quoting a scripture in this. Hosea 10, verse 8 says, "The high places also of Aven, the sin of Israel shall be destroyed. The thorn and the thistle shall come up upon their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us." Interesting picture, isn't it? You're asking the mountains, of course this is poetic in a sense, metaphorical, say to the mountains, cover us, or tell the hills to fall on us. Why would anybody ever want the hills or a mountain to fall on them? Isn't that the last thing anybody would ever want? If you're in a cave or something, you tell the mountain to fall on me? Well, the idea there, is one of panic and, trying to run from something. Hide us, cover us, fall on us. And that is obviously the way many Jews were going to feel in time whenever they are being made to answer, in an earthly sense at least, for their, and I guess technically in an eternal sense, it'll be the same way, similar concept. Fall on us, but it won't happen. No running, no hiding. So he says, weep for yourselves, weep for your children. It's going to be a very dark day when that day comes. So the name and location. Golgotha means place of a skull. But what about Calvary? Why do we always call it Calvary? Anybody know? Anybody know how many times the word Calvary is found in the Bible? Take a guess. 0 times, correct. Then why do we call it that? Well, it's because it's a Latin word. That's what it's called in Latin, and therefore it's become just one of the common references for this place is the Latin version. Of course, Latin was the spoken language, that was the language of the Roman Empire. We associate Latin with the Catholic Church, which is sort of, they're very closely related. But Latin would have been the language of the Roman Empire. But in Hebrew it's called Golgotha, which the translation of which is a place of the skull, probably appropriately named. All we know about the place is that, first of all, it was outside the gate of Jerusalem. Hebrews 13:12 says they led him outside the gate. It was near the city, obviously, John 19:20. It was evidently near to a well-traveled road, Matthew 27:39. A couple of different locations have been proposed for it, but obviously here's one of the proposed locations. But take it or leave it. Jesus had to go there, carry his cross.
Difficulty with a map like that. You don't see the hills and the valleys.
Yeah.
It wasn't level ground.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually up and down in several of those instances. Having been beaten twice,
Yeah.
it's only natural that he would have needed assistance
Yeah.
with the cross.
Yep. And they probably weren't too kind about it either. They probably weren't nice about it. The longer it takes him to get there, the more out of their day, it's an inconvenience to them. Like we said before last week, these were hard men. They would have had to have been hard men, even harder than what we would call a hard man. They would have to be able to do that job at all would take a certain kind of person, but especially to a man who's been, declared to be innocent, and they still don't seem to be concerned, at least not enough to keep them from mocking him and spitting on him and making fun of him. What kind of a heartless, soulless person does it take to do such things? So when Jesus, if he was struggling to carry the the cross that he was made to carry, they wouldn't have been gentle or tender or sympathetic. And that's why, they weren't even going to help carry it. So that's why they just pulled somebody out of the crowd and said, here, you get it, carry it for him. So there's no relief in any of this other than maybe the relief he would have gotten from Simon helping. And even for all we know, in the moment, Simon may not have been too nice about it either, because now he's been inconvenienced and he doesn't have any connection to this guy, as far as we know, and now he's sort of been cast in with him and being seen with him and all this. So for all he knew, this may have been a murderer. But here he is, and he's helping him to carry it. So when they arrive at Calvary, or Golgotha, their clothing normally would have been stripped. This is one of the things that is commonly overlooked or neglected. Maybe some people don't want to think about it, but it seems that historically speaking, the general process was that they would be totally naked. And there's only one solace that we might take from this Jesus specific case, is that based on the Jews' views of that, and considering that this was being done to appease the Jews in the first place, they would have considered that to be unlawful and inappropriate. So maybe they spared Jesus that at least because of the Jews' feelings. Remember, they're the ones that went to and said, we need to get this body down because of the time it is, and it shouldn't be up. And he did that for them in that case. So they probably would have had an issue with that too, and so they may have spared Jesus that. Wouldn't have been too much of a comfort for him, but at least it's a little thing at least for him to be spared that humiliation added on to everything else. They also would they had a drink that was made from a sour wine that was mixed with a sort of narcotic. And whenever we read about Jesus being offered this, it sounds like a cruel thing. And that's how I always took it, to be honest. Was thirsty, but instead of giving him water, they give him this nasty stuff. And then it's like, this didn't help quench his thirst at all. It made it worse maybe. What that was about the only mercy and courtesy that they offered in any of this, was offered that on a sponge, and offer it up there to help as a painkiller. It's not going to probably be near as powerful as some of the painkillers that we have today from a pharmacy or whatever. But it would have been at least they did that much. But then again, what do we read of Jesus doing whenever he tasted it? He wouldn't have it. He didn't want it. Isn't that amazing? Of course, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but he didn't want his senses to be dulled at all. And everybody else on the planet would have wanted nothing more than to have your senses dulled, as much as possible, because then you're not thinking about all the people, you're not thinking about what's happening. At least maybe it'll dull some of the pain, but he didn't want any of that. Did you have something, Joe?
Well, have you ever thought about if you had been there at that time? I mean, wherever Jesus was, there was always a crowd, because they were either fascinated with him, some believed that he was the Son of God or going to be the King. And what your role would have been at this time? Would we have been some of those sitting on the top of the side of the hill going, well, I wonder what's going on? As observers, would we have hidden because we were afraid, because we were one of his disciples?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a terrible thought, because in a lot of ways that's what we are today. We're either just sitting on the sideline watching life go by,
Yeah.
or we're in there pitching in, helping him in any way we can.
Yeah, we do read of some
Just sit and watch him.
some that did try to help, offered in some water and things like that. And even being there, there's not much they could do to help him really. But, and in a way, he may not have even wanted people to be there at all, if it was me, I probably wouldn't want, on one hand, I would appreciate the support, but on the other hand, I would sort of be like, I'd rather you not see it, and things like that. So there's not much they could do, but some of them still felt compelled to be there. And that's why we see, obviously, his mother there and some other women, and ultimately John. We see John appear again. One person we don't see is Peter. But we do see John. When Jesus said, "Woman, behold thy son," behold thy brother, or he said, "Woman, behold thy son." He wasn't talking about himself, according to the text. He was talking about John. And that was him giving his mother over to the care of John, which we'll discuss that when we get to that point, because it's very interesting. When he had living brothers, he gives his mother, as the firstborn son, he gives his mother over to the care of John, the apostle. So the process of crucifixion, or the cross, there were a few different kinds of cross. One cross was an uppercase T shape. One was a lowercase T shape. That was the Latin cross. One was an X shape. It seems most likely that the Latin version would have been used, the lowercase T, and that certainly helps us to see how there could be an inscription attached to the top of it. Of course, it could have been an uppercase T, for all we know. But the whole practice of crucifixion, many nations have used crucifixion, but it was invented by the Persians or Phoenicians, but the Romans adopted it, adapted it, and utterly perfected it, for lack of a better word. They had it down to an art. The whole ordeal was designed specifically to produce the slowest death possible with maximum amount of pain and suffering. That alone just shows you how cruel. When that is the design, back in the day, even whenever execution was still practiced here in our country, it isn't a whole lot anymore. Different topic, but the idea is almost the exact opposite of that. We have like a phrase, go prepare to meet your maker. That is sort of how the whole purpose of execution is. That was the idea of that, was you are going to meet your maker, because when coming from a Bible-believing person, that indicates a belief in what the Scriptures say, that, it's appointed unto man once to die and then the judgment. So your case is out of our hands and you're going to be judged by the judge. But the Romans, they had perfected this method of execution that was specifically to make it take as long as possible and to hurt as much as possible. Maximum pain, maximum suffering, slowest death. In fact, the word excruciating actually comes from, it comes from the root of that word is like crucified, crux. Excruciating has a relation to that, the term there, crucifixion. But the genius of this method of execution was in the fact that none of the vital organs were hurt. And that's why it would take so long. Everything was that could kill a person quickly was untouched, and the things that were not untouched were the things that would not necessarily take a person's life, and so it just took a very long time. And some could live for days on that cross, and then they would be in throbbing pain. They would be thirsty. They would be probably starting to fight off birds and insects and whatever. We're talking about the most horrific thing that you and I could ever imagine. And Jesus is about to start that process for himself when he did nothing to deserve it. Probably arguably the worst part would be how hard it would become to breathe. Anybody who's ever had trouble breathing, even for a short period of time, can attest to how torturous that is when you feel like you can't breathe or get a good breath. And as they're hanging there, they would have to draw themselves up as much as they could to be able to take a breath. And you could think about how painful that would be alone, to have to do that when you're nailed to something. And then breathing in, cramps, stirring the wounds again. It's just, there's no bright side to it. There's no silver lining of any kind, except for, in Jesus' case, that it'll be over. Eventually. It'll be over. And what it meant, in his case, what it meant for everybody else, not for himself. So, that's what's about to happen. He wasn't alone on the cross. We know there were 2 robbers there, crucified with him. Have you ever seen a picture of Jesus on the cross and the 2 thieves next to him, and he's nailed to it, but the other 2 are tied to it? Have you ever seen a picture like that? I don't know why they did that. Actually, I do know why they did that. Is to make Jesus different. It wasn't different. They would have been, the same thing would have been happening to them as it happened to Jesus, except, as the one thief said, we deserve it. He doesn't deserve it. So, again, that's another instance of trying to make it sound even worse than it was actually, which is counterproductive, in my opinion, to...
Were they usually beaten before they went to the cross, or was that an exception for Jesus?
It seems that was not normal. In other words, he says, the way the text lays it out, seems to have been Pilate's way of hoping that would satisfy them. That I find no guilt in him, so I'm going to punish him and release him. And then he has him scourged, flogged, and then he presents him back to them and says, okay, behold the man here. And they said, crucify him, and that had to have been one of the most shocking moments for Pilate, because none of it was making sense anyway. But now, how could this, what is going on here? And Jesus didn't give him any answers when he asked, and so he was just, all he knew was the Jews had backed him into a corner. And as I've said in our studies of the other lessons, Pilate has no excuse. He could have not been a pawn of the Jews, and Jesus was going to die for the sins of the world, but Pilate didn't have to incriminate himself in the process. So just like Judas had no excuse for betraying Jesus, Pilate had no excuse for giving in to the Jews' demands.
So that's why they had to pierce those 2. Jesus was already dead, but they weren't.
Well, for whatever reason, even though it had only been a few hours, the time had come, for whatever reason, that they said, all right, time to wrap this up, which is a mercy in itself. If you think about if there was ever a time when men had been there for days. So they went, that's what they were going to do. They were going to go ahead and put an end to it. And then they saw that Jesus was already dead, so they didn't need to do that. So they broke their legs. Let me take that back. They broke their legs to hasten, not to make it happen right then, but to hasten it, speed it up. But they didn't do that to Jesus because they said, this one's already dead. I don't know why they pierced him, I guess we'll see that when we come to it, but they treated him differently, and I think it's John that points out that was fulfillment of prophecy in itself. So, Isaiah 53, again, when we think about Messianic prophecy, Isaiah says, he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. So the fact that Jesus was with these 2 criminals who deserved to be up there, that was fulfillment of prophecy as well. So there's so much prophecy being played out right before their eyes. And all of it was because Adam and Eve sinned, and you and I have sinned. So that was why all this was happening. We blame the Jews, but Jesus wouldn't have had to come to the earth to die on the cross in the first place if it wasn't for sin. So if it wasn't Adam and Eve, it would have been Cain. If it wasn't Cain, it would have been somebody. If it wasn't somebody, it would have been me eventually. And so it would have unfolded one way or the other. So finally, as we're out of time, Pilate puts an inscription above Jesus' head that says, the full account putting all the accounts together, seems to have been, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Jews didn't like that very much. They said, no, that's not true. That's what he said. He's not really that. That's what he said he was. Pilate said, don't care. So that, a very small, joyless victory, but at least he had that much, that whether he meant it as an insult to the Jews by design or whether he was okay with it after he realized that it insulted them, obviously he wasn't going to cater to them anymore. But that was what he had put above, which it was also an insult to Jesus because it was a mocking claim of what he said. So here the crucifixion begins about 9 a.m. 6 hours he would be on that cross, which is a very, very long time. Next lesson we'll look, Lord willing, at the first 3 hours, and then we'll look at the last 3 hours and continue on. Any other thoughts, comments?
I'm going to add one thing. That, at any point in time, Christ could have chosen to put a stop to it. But he didn't.
Yep.
He didn't have to go through that. He chose to.
Yep, just like he told Peter, don't you think if don't you understand I have the authority? I could ask my Father and he'd send 12 legions of angels. I don't need you with your little dagger or blade or whatever you have. And Peter knew that. He just wasn't thinking, which, so many times our problem is we're not thinking. We're no different. All right, hopefully as we look at this, it should stick with us and we should remember it every day, and it should change the way we live and the way we act and think even, that greater love has no man than this, as man has never known, than to lay his life down for his friends. And Jesus, he didn't just lay down his life, he left heaven to come and just to do this. This was why he came. To preach God's word, establish God's kingdom, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So we should pay him back by giving our lives to him in service, a living sacrifice, not on a cross, but in daily service everywhere we go.